and welcome to the Caritas Consciousness Project. I'm Gloria Quidu, and we have a fascinating subject tonight that I'm very excited about, which is Sufism, the mystical tradition of Islam. A lot of people associate Sufism with Sufi dancing, which is correct, but there's a lot more to it. It's a 1,400-year-old mystical tradition with origins in Middle East and Central Asia. And also many people have heard of the poet Rumi and have heard some of his poetry. He was a Sufi poet, as was Kabir. And our presenter tonight, Netanel Miles-Yepez, is the current head of the Inayati-Maimuni Order of Sufism. Hopefully I said that right. He is an artist, a writer, a philosopher, and a scholar of comparative religion. Pir Netanel first studied history of religions at Michigan State University, and then contemplative religion at the Naropa Institute, before pursuing traditional studies and training in both Sufism and Hasidism with his Pir and rebbe Zalman, I can never say his name right, Schachter-Shalomi.
Schachter-Shalomi.
I've certainly heard of him from many instances of reading and talking to people in the area. He was the famous pioneer in interfaith dialogue and comparative mysticism. And he was right here in Boulder, Colorado, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So currently, Pir Netanel lives in Boulder, where he is a professor in the Department of Religious Studies at Naropa University, and from which he leads the Inayati-Maimuni Order. So please welcome Netanel. And Netanel, you said you like kind of an interactive type format so that people can just ask questions whenever they feel like it. Is that correct?
That's correct. And this is a small group. That's easy enough. And much more fun for me and less boring for you. Shall I begin?
Yes, please.
Well, Peter, I know. Sharon, Jane, nice to meet you. I think I'd like to begin with a story, or a parable, really. And the parable is it's approximately 1,000 years old. And it's told in Sufism as a kind of answer to the question, what is Sufism? And it's called the parable of tea. So let me load it here in my mind. So it goes like this. Once tea was unknown outside of China, but word of the celestial drink had made its way down the Silk Road and into the kingdoms it connected. In one kingdom, called India, here, the king of India had heard word that the celestial drink existed in China, and so he wanted to verify what it tasted like and what it was like, whether it was a real thing or a legend. And so he called his ministers to the court and told them that he was going to send them as ambassadors into China to verify whether the celestial drink tea actually existed. So the ambassadors start to make their way in a caravan up the Silk Road and deep into the heart of China. And they make it all the way to the Forbidden City and are granted admittance and even granted an audience with the Emperor of China. because they're emissaries of a king. And so they come before the high throne of the Emperor of China, and they make their petition. Forgot to turn off my phone.
I just did that too.
So they come before the Emperor of China, and they say, "Your Radiant Highness, Son of Heaven, we are ambassadors from the King of India, and we are sent with a request to taste the celestial drink known as tea." Now the Emperor of China on his high throne does not deign to speak to the lowly ministers of the lowly kingdom of India. He knows not where. And merely gestures. And then a minister of his takes them to another chamber off of the great hall, where they're seated at a low table and serve tea. And the ministers reach down, they take the tea, they drink. And indeed, it is the celestial drink. It is somehow both stimulating and calming at the same time. And so they're thrilled. And being very pleased with themselves, having achieved their mission very successfully, and having driven a hard road up into China and gone as fast as possible to accomplish their mission, they decide to take the slow road back, see the sights, sample the local fare, the Chinese food. And so they stop in a roadhouse on their way back. And they seated at a table, and wait staff comes up and pours a drink for them, and they take it and they drink, and they find it's the very same drink they were served by the emperor. And then they look around and they see that everyone is drinking this tea. Merchants, noblemen, peasants, everyone drinks tea. And now that great inflation of their success deflates, and they're very disquieted. And they make their way back to the little kingdom of India, here. And they come before the king, who says, "Well, did you taste the tea, the celestial drink?" And they say, "Your Highness, we were served something that was called tea, but we think they either played a joke on us or did not think of us worthy of serving us the real tea, because both noblemen and peasants drank it, the same drink." Elsewhere, in a land called Anja, there was a great philosopher. Indeed, he was the greatest philosopher of the region. And his special subject was tea. He knew everything there was to know about tea. He'd written the definitive treatise on tea because, being located along the Silk Road, you could expect travelers to come from all over. And whenever a traveler would come through the region, this philosopher would go and interview them to see what they knew about tea. Thus, you could open his great treatise and read, "Some people say it's golden in color. Some say greenish. Some say it's bitter. Some say sweet. Some say it's a dry leaf. Some say it's a liquid." He knew everything there was to know about tea, but he never tasted it. In yet another land called Mazhab, sectarianism, in case you didn't know we were telling a parable, in the land of sectarianism, they'd actually managed to get a hold of a little tea, a little sachet of tea, which they worshipped. And one day each year, they would take out the little bag of tea from a special box, from a special building, and suspend it from 4 long strings to 2 great staves that sat on the shoulders of 4 great big grim-faced men, who would then carry the bag of tea through the capital city And everybody would come out because it was a holiday, and as it passed, everyone would prostrate. And this went on year after year, the central holiday of the kingdom of Mazhab, sectarianism, until one year a visitor to the city was witness to the procession. And as all the throng of the crowds came out, and as the little bag of tea, suspended from the four long strings to the two great staves carried by the four great big men, passed, everyone bowed, except the visitor to the city. And he leaned forward to look in to get a better look, and it's a bag of tea. And then he looked up and he said, "No, you idiots, you have to pour boiling water on it." A gasp goes through the crowd. And the priests of the tea look angrily at the man and point to the religious police, who immediately arrest him. And he's later killed as a heretic for suggesting the destruction of the sacred tea. You pour boiling water on those fragile little leaves, you're going to wreck it. Fortunately for us, he had told the secret of tea to a few friends in the city, and had even left them with his private stash. And so these friends, knowing not to talk about infusing the tea in public, seeing what happened to their friends, decide that they want to pursue this secret in private. So they take the tea and they infuse it in private, and indeed it's wonderful. And so in this way they form a little secret society. And they meet once a week where they drink the tea in private, and if anybody happens to pass by the window or the door and ask them what they're drinking, they always say, "Just a little medicine." And week after week, drinking the tea, they grew in wisdom, until the wisest among them said this: "The one who tastes knows. The one who tastes not knows not. Stop talking about the celestial drink, but serve it at your banquets. Those who like it will ask for more. Those who don't are not fitted to be tea drinkers. Close the shop of argument and open the tea house of experience." In this way, these merchants of fabrics and merchants of jewels and pliers of different trades all along the Silk Road became the first merchants of tea. And now when they would go out on the road and stop at some city, they would pull out a stool, sit down, brew a little tea, and share it with whoever might be passing. And in this way, the circles of the tea drinkers began, and up sprang the chaikanas, which then started to dot the map of all of Central Asia, the tea houses. And this is how the true use and knowledge of tea became widely known. The question is, what is the tea? And since this is interactive, what do you think?
So what kind of tea? Is that your question? Or
What is the tea? If the tea is the metaphor.
Oh, I see. Okay, I would venture to say it is the truth that lies within.
The truth that lies within. What else?
I would say that it is the experience of of life rather than the knowledge about it. It's the experience of it.
Mm-hmm.
Good experience of it. Anything else?
Say the Dharma.
You would say that. The Dharma, yes. They would have said the deen, which would have been the parallel term in the Middle East. The way, the path, what you should do. Well, that's just it. The T can stand for so many things, but the story does give us indications about what it might mean. So let's rewind and go back. So first, the tea is equated, with this idea of a celestial drink, a heavenly drink, as it were. And the king of India here's a rumor about it. Inja and Anja are words, Persian words. And so the story comes out of that region where people spoke Farsi. So the king of here, Inja, has tell of such a celestial drink, such a heavenly drink called tea, but it hasn't made its way out of China yet. So it's just a rumor. And he wants to verify its existence. But what kind of king who's curious is satisfied with his ministers drinking it and not to taste it himself? It's said of King Arthur, that he and all of his knights would enter the woods for the adventure, all from a different spot, knowing they would all have a different adventure. And that was a true king. The idea of a true king is important. The one that has to have the experience for themselves. It's not good enough for your ministers to taste it and tell you, oh, there's such a thing. So we already know that this is the kind of king who is really curious, will send people on an adventure which may cost them their life, which costs him nothing. And he's not even that interested in life to taste it. So already it's a kind of king that we don't necessarily admire. The ambassadors of the king, they do make the adventure. And they go all the way up into the heart of China, and this would be no easy journey. And to gain admittance to the Forbidden City would be an amazing thing. And they get to taste the tea. But after having tasted and being pleased with it, when they stop at a local roadhouse and they taste it again, they're disquieted. Why were they upset? Do you remember?
It wasn't special to them. The low life and the high life both got to drink this tea.
Mm-hmm. Which makes them what?
Ego-centered.
Snobs, elitists.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's precisely it. So much so that they don't believe it could have been the real tea. When they get back, no matter what their experience of it was, remember they thought it was amazing, both stimulating and calming at the same time, that particular quality of tea. And they get back and they think, well, they played a joke on us. They didn't think we were worthy of the real tea because both peasant and royalty drank it. And being elitist, they think everything must be elevated to a degree that it's separated from the common people. And so whatever this tea is, it is truly available to all. But someone could opt out of its benefit by the way they conceive of it. Elsewhere, in the land of Anja, there we have the great philosopher, the world's greatest expert on tea, who'd written the authoritative treatise and who had never tasted it. Now, what is this like? Who would this be today?
Intellectuals. Oh, excuse me.
Intellectuals, Peter?
That academic.
Theologians.
Theologians, yes. If you're in the academy, you recognize these people very well. Especially if, like me, you're a professor of religion in the academy and a practitioner, there's a stark difference. I remember once when I was in college still studying history of religions, I was in my carrel in the library with a big stack of books, and they all said mysticism. And I'm reading through a big tome on mysticism, and a good scholar is telling me, these people say this, these people say this, these people say this, these people say that. And it dawned on me, he doesn't know anything. Mm-hmm. He has no experience of what he's calling unio mystica, the mystical union. He's telling me what everyone else says. Well, that's good scholarship, he's bracketing ideas, as we say. But then I thought, can he tell me anything? What does he know? And it became a moment of decision. What do I want to know? Do I want to know what people say? Or do I want to have the experience? And he'd already privileged something that he called unio mystica, which was conceived of as a kind of non-dual experience of God. But is that the only mystical experience, a non-dual one? Is not a joy or ecstasy in a moment of prayer or any movement of the heart a mystical experience? Why privilege this one as the only? And he'd already done this, never having had the experience. And so the philosopher of tea is very much like the intellectual who builds a lot of head knowledge, but doesn't have a lot of experiential knowledge. And yet we give a lot of weight to the opinions of such people when they are really sources of information. In Sufism, we use two basic words for knowledge. In English, we usually just say knowledge. But in Arabic, you can talk about ilm, like ILM, or you can talk about marifa. Now, ilm as knowledge, but it means information. You can tell me something and I can write down my notes about it. It is everything that could be collected in a book. Whereas marifa is experiential knowledge. It's tasted wisdom, the hikmat al-zawqiyah, tasted wisdom. Like any experience, any taste, one has a primary experience which they cannot unknow, like love. I could never prove that I was in love, but I can't deny it to myself if I am, or any experience. I had a Dharma teacher years ago who his favorite example was to talk about a Snicker bar. And he used this in a lot of different ways, but he usually used it in talking about Madhyamaka philosophy, the non-dual philosophy of Buddhism. This was Panlop Rinpoche. And he says, well, it's very much like the Snickers bar. He says, I taste it, and you taste it, and we think we're having the same experience, but we really have no idea whether we're eating the same Snickers bar or not. We're each having a unique experience, and we just think that we're sharing the same thing. And so any experience has that quality of being uniquely ours. And there's a great deal of difference between this kind of head knowledge and experiential knowledge. So the philosopher of tea can know all the information and yet know nothing about the actual subject. And this is very important for us to consider as readers of books on spirituality. Because the reading experience is a really interesting thing for us as human beings. We read things, and if we comprehend them, we feel as if we've had the experience that is talked about there. And yet, as Robin Williams' wonderful character points out to Good Will Hunting in that movie, he said, but you've never stood in the Sistine Chapel. You may know everything about Michelangelo, but you don't know what it smells like in there. You don't know what the light is, what the feel and the ambiance of the place is. And so this is very important because we trick ourselves into thinking we know many things about which we know nothing. And we can be pleased about information, but we need to have humility about it at the same time. And this is very important on the spiritual path. And so they point out, whatever the tea is, the great expert knows nothing in this case. So we have the elitists, and we have the head knowledge people. Now we go to the land of Mazhab, sectarianism, where they have a little bag of tea. It's in their possession. But they worship it in a dry form, which is, they might say, religion without the infusion of spirituality. Religion is in many ways like information in a book. It's dry. It's dogmas, it's teachings, it's a whole collection of lore, it's a collection of theology and practices, but the practice itself and the experience, even more important, the experience that comes from the practice, is the spirit. And the two can unfortunately get divorced. And that's what we have in this case. In the land of Mazhab sectarianism, we have religion where tea is worshipped in a dry form without the infusion of spirituality. But if the tea is, as we've already said, truth, the experience of truth, the experience, the spiritual experience itself, the Dharma, what they have in a dry form is the report of somebody else's experience. As my teacher used to say, that so much of religion is really the afterthought of a primary experience. Jesus goes into the desert for 40 days, has an awakening experience. The Prophet Muhammad in the cave of Hira has an awakening experience. Moses ascends to the mountain, has an awakening experience. The Buddha under the bo tree has an awakening experience. And then they come back, and it's often described of such a person that their face shone. That old-fashioned word, we now only see it in poetry, right? Their face shone, but it has a light on it, as it were. And we sometimes meet some people that have this kind of light on them. And sometimes it's mere charisma, sometimes it's something more. Like there's a qualitative shift. You imagine Jesus' buddies after he came back from the desert, saying, what happened? And some of them being disappointed with who he is now, and some being compelled by something inside that says, he's got a light on him that I want to know about. And what often happens is that the people that are curious and compelled by that light get out their notebooks and they want to know, where were you? What did you do? What happened? What happened on the 39th day? The devil came and spoke to you? He offered you what? 3 gifts? All the treasure in the world? You know, bread when you're hungry, all of these things. And they take down all the notes. And this happens in the formation of all religions, that disciples doing exactly what they should do, taking notes, as it were, to make a map back to the source experience, often forget that the map is not the territory, or forget what the map was for. So many of our map makers in different religious traditions forgot it was a map to take them somewhere, to somebody's primary experience. What was attractive about Jesus was that light on him and that change in his character. That's what they wanted. That's why they made the map. Gloria?
It's like they worship the map instead of what it's representing,
Mm-hmm.
right? Just like building a scaffolding and then forgetting to take it down and worshiping the scaffolding.
Exactly. It doesn't take very long in the formation of a religion for this to happen. If you're lucky, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say that it's much easier to study the map than it is to invoke or allow the true experience to happen to you. Studying something is easy, hoping that you will get to that experience, but getting to it is another story.
Entirely. Sharon?
Yeah, this reminds me of religions I've heard about from centuries ago, where there was our disagreement about whether to write things down or not, that it was wrong to write things down, that the experience was what really mattered, not the... So it sounds like a similar idea?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
I had a professor who was one of the great scholars of a mystical tradition called Kashmiri Shaivism. And he says one of the problems of being a scholar of this tradition is that in the tradition, once they'd studied the books, they threw them away. Mm-hmm. So, you know, it was to serve a certain purpose, and then you were to drop them and not stay in you know, it's as if the books were the dry material which needed to be infused. But just like the heresy of the land of Mazab, they thought to pour boiling water on the leaves was to destroy them, when really the real gift of the leaves was the experience itself. And that's very much what our books are. This happens in Rumi's life too. Rumi, before he has his great awakening, is a great, great scholar. In fact, he would have been, we don't have anything like this in our culture, but in his culture, he would have been like a rock star as a scholar. Maybe the kind of person that Dan Brown creates for the Da Vinci Code. So he would have been like this guy. And one day, Rumi is sitting on a blanket with his books, a whole stack of rare books, and a wandering dervish walks up, still with the dust of the desert on him, and says, "What are all these books? How many of these books have you read?" And Rumi says, "As many as you can load on a camel," which may have been a way of counting back then. And the man says, "Do you want to know something that's not in these books?" So, of course. And the man reaches down, and being a Qalandar, a wild dervish, scoops up all the books and he throws them into the well. and Rumi just flips out, being a man of books. You know, that was my father's rare manuscript. That was the book. and the man says, "Oh, I'm sorry." And he goes over to the well and he pulls the books out and lays them down, and they are completely dry. And then Rumi, noticing what should not be, realizes there may be something to learn. And he says, "What can I learn from you?" And the man points to the books. And we're not told what that means, but I think it's clear enough. Those books will never get wet. They're dry. They won't come to life. They won't have that sensual experience. You know, it's an erotic image that he's pointing out. This is like talking about sex. and it's never going to happen. You have never tasted life. And at that point, he gets up and follows him. And then it's at that point that Rumi becomes a wild ecstatic. And one of the interesting things about him, we have all this poetry from Rumi, right? He never wrote a word. He stopped writing. All of that poetry is what his students just collected as they followed behind him, listening to him reciting. And none of them are poems in themselves. He would just recite all these couplets. And some of them went together, some of them didn't. And they collected and memorized them, and then they tried to assemble them into some sort of order. And there are 3 or 4 collections of them. One collection, the Divan-i-Kabir, is over 40 volumes. And that's just one of the collections that comes from Rumi. So it gives you an idea of what he was before. He was the philosopher of tea. And then once he tastes it, there's an awakening of the real person. So what often happens in religion, we see, and like I said, if we're lucky, it takes a few generations. And what happens over time is, you know, there's the sacred map of how to get to that spiritual experience, that awakening experience. But a generation or 2 later, they look at the map and, what is this thing for? Well, it came from Jesus. Oh, let's put it in a box. And then let's make the box fancy. And let's house that box in a temple. And let's make the temple fancy. And then pretty soon you need people to clean the temple, you need people to do services there, you need people to shine the box. And it becomes its own institution, and it doesn't remember what its function is. They become mere custodians of a box that holds the map to a spiritual experience that they never try to attain. And this may happen fairly naturally. You know, we don't necessarily want to condemn them for not getting it. But I think where it gets more complicated is that the institution begins to think only of its own support. Well, how do we pay the costs of the temple and the cleaning of the box? And how do we pay the staff, which is them, the priests of the map, as it were? And so the focus moves away from the spiritual experience. And as, you know, Alan Watts would say, he says, the problem with Christianity is they pedestalize Jesus. They put him on such a pedestal that they never tried to have the experience. And he says that's a real cop-out. because Jesus' experience said that that he had an experience of his own, you might say, his divine sonship, that he was a child of God, that he was a chip off the old block, as it were, and that is really our inheritance. And as Watts put it, he said, and the truth was not that he was the only son of God, but that he knew it. He knew he was the child of God, and that's the principal difference. And wanted to give us that experience of knowing that, but couldn't make us take it. And so the problem of putting Jesus on the pedestal is to give away your own responsibility for taking the journey. That we need to take the journey. And when we say, oh, well, the Buddha did that, Moses did that, Jesus did that, I could never do that, then it becomes questionable what it is you're doing at all. If they're not inspiring us with enough confidence to take the journey, they may not be in the right place. And that's what often happens with religion. And though I'm a great defender of religion, in fact, my initiatory name in Sufism is Muinadin, which means a defender or shield of the way, of the path, of religion. I don't like to condemn religion, but I think that we misconceive what it's for. Bad religion is when we forget that the map is meant to take you somewhere. Good religion is when you use the map and you take responsibility for taking the journey. And you don't allow anybody else to be responsible for your path. So this is the kingdom of Mazab, where they forgot to infuse it with experience. Or it's like a freeze-dried thing, like they had ramen noodles. Perhaps a bad example because they're not that nutritious, but you get the idea of the freeze-dried thing, That's what a lot of religion is. It's freeze-dried experience. And if we remember that, then it can be very useful to us. Oh, that's a body of lore and tools, not all of it correct, but it's been preserved for us to use and to make use of and make the best use of it we can. There's a collection of 1 billion teachings in that museum, as it were, of holiness. And we can take advantage of it. But then it's on us. It has nothing to give us. It's holding our own inheritance. Religion is not in control of our experience. Gloria?
I think the problem with Christianity, I'll only speak for Christianity, is that it doesn't tell us that there is such a thing as direct experience. Matthew Fox said in 7 years of seminary training, he never had one class on mysticism. Mm-hmm. I think that's the problem, as you say, putting Jesus on a pedestal. I remember as a child in Catholic school, and the nuns would say, we have to follow the, Jesus' example. We have to, and I would think, yeah, easy for him. He was God. I'm just a mortal. That's the message. He was God, and I'm just a mortal, and I'm not, right? and there was a big difference in in how they presented. And so we peons, we need an intermediary. We need a priest to be the intermediary. The priest is also not God, but he's closer, right?
Mm-hmm. I really liked it was it some 15, 20 years ago? young evangelical Christians were wearing bracelets, that had, what would Jesus do? They just had the letters, and I thought that's the right question, because that is at least the beginning of following the map. What would Jesus do? I want to model myself on that behavior. And, and from that perspective, then you can get, radically interesting perspectives like those of the great African-American mystic, Reverend Howard Thurman, who wrote Jesus and the Disinherited. Looking at Jesus as a figure who is embracing the disinherited and giving them a way to freedom. And by asking that question, what would Jesus do? And looking at Jesus as an exemplary model. An exemplary model, an accessible one, not an archetypal one. Go ahead.
Was he calling the disinherited, was that the followers of Jesus? I mean, was that the churchgoers? Because Jesus was trying to get us, I believe, to have our own experience, right? The kingdom of God is within you. Mm-hmm. So the disinherited, in my mind, would be the people today who are followers of the religion, worshipers of the map, so to speak. Is that what he meant by that? Because I haven't read that book.
It's a slim book, and often today it has a foreword by Vincent Harding, who some of you may have met or seen at some time. He just died a few years ago, who was a teacher at Isla School of Theology. And what Thurman points out is that Jesus' ministry, principal ministry, were to people that were on the margins and who were marginalized. The Mary Magdalens, and telling the story of the Good Samaritan. And what we don't realize today is that in that society, the Samaritan was actually a marginalized person. And in that parable of the Good Samaritan, it's the pious elite who pass up, the person who needs help on the side of the road. And a Samaritan in that time would have been somebody who was seen as doing everything wrong, doing religion, incorrectly. And so he really has a message that is really about embracing the margins. Mm-hmm. And then Howard Thurman applied it to civil rights. But I think it's infinitely applicable. Jesus was really reaching to the margins. Jane?
Well, I have a question, which is, I think I'm getting what you're saying about religion and the map and the experience. How does this relate to Sufism, which is a religion, right? I mean, or is it?
Good. Well, that's a good place to start. So what comes next after we have, the man who is executed as a heretic for proposing the destruction of the sacred tea, as having a spiritual experience is what he's suggesting. Really? There's been a long-held tension between prophets and priests, or shamans and priests. And we need both, because the priests archive the tradition. They hold it. And the tension is based on that shamans and prophets have primary experiences. Mm-hmm. They're having the experience. And they're a kind of danger to religion, because the priests are preserving, this is how it is. Mm-hmm. But when somebody has a new experience, it threatens what is preserved there. Mm-hmm. And so there's a lot of tension in that experience. And that's really what comes up here. The man calls out from the crowd and says, "No, you idiots, you have to pour boiling water on it." And he has a This is a parable, the parable I said that comes from 1,000 years ago. And about 1,000 years ago was a Sufi mystic called Monsoor al-Hallaj. And al-Hallaj is famous and infamous for, during an ecstatic experience, crying out in his ecstasy, Anal Haq, Anal Haq, I am the truth. And after which he was arrested and killed as a heretic. Because to the literal minded of his day, he was saying, my ego is God. Al-Hallaj is God, worship me. Now the truth was, the Haq was, that he was having exactly, precisely the opposite experience. That his ego had been wiped out for a moment, and the truth spoke through him. I am the truth. And so there was no ego in it whatsoever. It was God speaking. And so the literal minded, not able to understand this, kills him for this. And so that becomes a lesson in the Sufi tradition, that we don't necessarily need to parade our ecstasy in the streets, parade our spiritual experiences among people who won't necessarily understand them. And so we have the other part of the story where they begin to brew and taste the tea in secret. And they would do this on Thursday nights. I left this detail out, but which is the night of Sufi practice, the primary night of Sufi practice. And then it says, and having tasted it week after week, they became wise, and the wisest among them said this, the one who tastes knows. The one who tastes not knows not. Stop talking about the celestial drink, but serve it at your banquets. Those who like it will ask for more. Those who don't are not fitted to be tea drinkers. Close the shop of argument, talk, and open the tea house of experience. Let's just share it. Let's not talk about it too much. And then it says, in this way, these merchants of fabrics and other pliers of trades became the first merchants of tea. Right? So what this is meant to say, and the reason this parable is told as an introduction to Sufism, you could also say the tea is Sufism, is that, to paraphrase the words of one more recent Sufi master, that Sufism is a school of experience, not dogma. So, which is to say, it's not really meant to be a set of teachings, specific teachings that tell you what the world is and how to conceive of it, but it is really a collection of practices, or doing the practices that create the experience which tell you what you believe. Mm-hmm. Now, theology tells you what to believe.
Right.
But this, if there's theology in Sufism, it's a theology that comes after an experience. So that your theology doesn't come from what a professor of theology told you, but your theology is a personal theology formed out of your personal spiritual experiences. And then it's more like, oh, the universe is constellated like this. How do I know that? That was my experience.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And so Sufism doesn't characterize it so much as a religion, but as an opportunity for experiencing God, as it were. And it's up to you whether you think that that's God. It really just says, taste this. Try this on. Do this thing. You see. If it's beneficial to you, well, good. If it's not, don't do it. But that begs the question: where does Sufism come from, and how is it connected to religion, traditional religion? Now it's always complicated because if you ask a traditional Sufi, especially one from Persia, like now I would know enough not to ask them, what is your tradition? Are you a Sufi? Because if I ask them that, even if they are a Sufi, they will say no. And so it's tricky. Traditional Sufis know that they're not supposed to say that they're Sufis. And it's because that would imply arrogance. It would imply that I've attained a level that I have not necessarily attained. Whereas in the West, it's merely practical. It'd just be confusing to people if they asked me, well, what is your tradition? Are you a Sufi? And I said no. And then I talked about Sufism all the time.
Yeah.
Westerners would just be puzzled. So it's a compromise here. What I usually say is, I'm trying to be a Sufi.
Mm.
I aspire to be a Sufi. But then if you ask Sufis, what is the origin of Sufism? Traditional ones will often say, Sufism has always existed. There's no origin to Sufism. Or one Sufi master said, a river passes through many lands, and in each land it has a different name, but there's only one river. And that's an answer to, where did Sufism come from? It's just the river. And what they mean by that is that from the moment there was a human being or human consciousness that had that stirring of the heart, or that longing of the heart, or that movement of the heart to wonder about what is greater, from that moment there was a Sufi. And so among Sufis, they always think of, Adam and Hawa, Adam and Eve, as the first Sufis, of course, because they were the first ones to have that consciousness that looked to the greater, that looked to God, that longed for something else, something more, and an expanded experience of life in the universe. And from that perspective, everyone who is that and has that experience is a Sufi. And so though maybe not accepted by all, I've heard very traditional Sufi masters talk about the Buddha as a prophet. Because why not? Obviously, that's a Sufi. They think that's both a prophet connected to Islam and a Sufi, clearly. Because they've had an awakening in their consciousness. And that's all that the Sufism really is. On the other hand, Sufism has a character and specific practices. You might say it has a culture, right? And that culture is not the same as you'd find, in a Zen monastery in Japan. That's a different culture. And so there is some distinction about what is Sufism. It has an ultimate character, which is really just an expansion of consciousness. And then it has a local character, which is a culture. And so as a historian of religion, I have to hold both. What Sufis say, and then trying to trace the actual origins in history and the origins of that culture. And one of the most interesting ways of doing that is through etymology, the origin of words. And this is a kind of a great preoccupation of Sufis too. They'd like to speculate, where did the word Sufi come from, or Sufism? And so there are three strong candidates The three, there are actually about 10, but 3 of them come up all the time. And they tell us a lot about the origins of Sufism. The first one is that the word Sufi comes from Sufa. And Sufa is a word you might recognize from your living room. Sofa. Sufa meant a bench or something that you reclined or sat on. And in the history of Islam, after the Prophet Muhammad left Mecca and came to Medina, the first thing he did was establish a mosque there. And it was not long before there was a group of people that would congregate outside the mosque and kind of never left it. And they call these people the Ali Sufa, the people of the bench. And some people looked at them in some ways how some people look at the homeless, like derelict and lazy. But the knowers of the great knowledge, it says, knew that they were ecstatics who never left the mosque because they could never get enough of talking about God. They just didn't go home because they were so caught up in what this thing was. There were those people for whom it was enough to go and pray and then go about their lives. But for these people, it was never enough. They could never drink enough of these experiences. And this is no different today. You know, you have Sunday religion people, and then you have people that it just intoxicates them. They want more from it, more and more. And it said that that's what the people of the bench were. And it said that these were the first Sufis. They were among the first Muslims, but they were the ones that were ecstatics and even a little crazy. You know, they went overboard, as it were. They couldn't do enough, they couldn't talk enough about God, and they never went home. And there are some that even say that combine this teaching with another teaching that says that the first Sufis were once a group that did not have a name. In fact, among Sufis we say, there's a traditional saying, like, just as, you know, we tell the parable of tea as an explanation of, or as an answer to the question, what is Sufism? So I tell this parable. That's the answer. But Sufis are always asking themselves questions as a practice, and the question is, what is Sufism? And then they repeat these different definitions of Sufism, different answers given through the history of Sufism. And one of the things that's said in the tradition is that once Sufism was a reality without a name. Now it is but a name without a reality. Once Sufism was a reality without a name. Now it is but a name without a reality. And you know what that is? That's an admonition. That is a challenge. And it's not coming from outside of Sufism, it's coming from Sufis themselves. To say, are we the real thing? Once, we were the real thing, and we didn't even have a name. We weren't even called Sufis yet. Now, we put on the hat, we carry the beads, we wear the shawl, we carry the name, and sometimes we don't carry the reality. And that's the proper challenge when you're on a spiritual path. To say, did I buy my practice? You know, at old Tibet, you know, where I can get beads and a bell and dorje, and is it that easily purchased? So that's the name without a reality. And so this is one of the oldest teachings in Sufism, to repeat this to ourselves. But there's also a teaching that says, and once it really was a reality without a name, that there were a group of mystics who traveled the world. And from generation to generation, they traveled across the planet, really, always in search of the Kuttab. And the Kuttab is an Arabic word that means the pole or axis, the fulcrum. And the idea of the Kuttab was that at any given moment on the planet, there is a human being who is the embodiment of what a human being is meant to be, who is so God-connected that they are the fulcrum of events for humanity, and there's a magnetism around them. And this early group of mystics without a name, from generation to generation, they were attuned to that magnetism and traveled in search of it, wherever it was on the planet. Whoever the Kuttab was, they would go in search of them and then orient around that pole. And so it's said, in the time of the Prophet Muhammad, in the 7th century, he was the Kuttab for that moment. And so this band of mystics who had already existed for millennia had found their way into Arabia, into the city of Medina, and organized themselves as a circle around the pole of religion in that time, the pole of spirituality in that time. And thus, their mysticism took on an Islamic character, because that's who the Kuttab was in that time. A prophet who was revealing a reform message of the Abrahamic religions. And it's also said that they became the people of the bench. They were already homeless, so they just slept outside the mosque. On the other hand, linguistically, we don't believe that the word Sufi could actually be derived from Sufa, for reasons that it would be too hard to explain. Another popular explanation among Sufis is to say that it comes from the Arabic word safa, which means pure or purity. And thus, a Sufi is the one who is trying to attain purity. And that made a lot of sense to them. Indeed, there's, Sufism, there's no such word except in English. The ism is an anglicized version of Sufism. What the word is in Arabic is tasawwuf, which means purification or purifying. So if there's a name for the path, it just means the path of purification. And that's related to safa, purity. And yet, still linguistically, we don't believe you can actually derive Sufi from the word safa, even though it's a good explanation. And this is me coming around to the answer to your question, Jane. Where we think the word Sufi actually comes from is the Arabic suf, which means wool. It's the word for wool. And this is fascinating because in the Middle East in that period, wool is not the most comfortable of fabrics to wear. If you had your druthers, you would want to wear cotton. Cotton, however, was the fabric of the elite or the wealthy. And wool was what you would see the people who were the desert parents of Christianity wearing. the Amas and Abbas of desert spirituality and Christianity, who would be the ascetic mystics of the period. And those ascetic mystics were all over the Middle East. They were in Egypt, they were in Central Asia. And these early Muslims witnessed them wearing wool and took on the practice of wearing the wool, inspired by these Christian desert mystics. And they were called the Sufiya, the wool wearers. And it was a pejorative. You know, many movements don't name themselves, or they give themselves names which don't stick. The names that tend to stick are the ones that the people that point at them give. And it's often a joke. You know, so it was a joke to call them the wool wearers, the woolly ones. But the name stuck. And who they really were, it seems, the earliest Sufis appear to have been religious and political dissidents, protesters. And what they were protesting was the degradation of Islam. When Islam began in the 7th century, it was a movement of the disenfranchised. Poor people, widows, orphans, other disenfranchised people who gathered together. All of them were put upon by the elite of the society. It was a society that there was a growing gap between the haves and have-nots. The middle class had diminished, and there were only very wealthy people and very poor people. And the original message, if you look at the first revelations that come from the Prophet Muhammad, and we can trace what the earliest ones were, they're almost all saying the same thing. They're accusations toward a wealthy elite, a powerful elite, saying, you have forgotten your duty to the widow, the orphan, and the poor. You act as if there is not karma, basically. You think there is not a punishment for this. This is your duty. You exist to take care of others. And it is a constant messaging of an absence of, or a failure to carry out a duty by a certain part of the population. And so, who becomes the first Muslims but the disenfranchised ones?
Right.
And they become very, they have to suffer a lot for these beliefs. They're spit upon, there's terrible stories of how persecuted they were. Even the Prophet Muhammad, people threw entrails on him and garbage. And he had gone from being perhaps the most respected citizen of Mecca to being the most reviled. So much so that at a certain point when God says it's time to go public, he's been getting revelations for 3 years. But he really doesn't want to talk about it because he knows as soon as he talks about it, he's going to lose his position in society. And finally God says, it's time to go speak publicly. But he's just so crushed under the weight of the news, but he does it. And he does, he loses his position in society. And those followers, you have to imagine, though the religion binds them, they had to be very sincere to stay with it. But then Islam became such a successful religion, and in some ways it got overtaken by the people that had once persecuted them, became converts, and then took over the power structures. So for the former persecutors, when they converted, they undermined the religion. And those were the people that started taking Islam on a kind of crusade, into Persia and into the Roman Empire and all the way to Spain and all across North Africa. And when they did that, the religion became very wealthy. very quickly because of, accumulating treasure through conquest. And so 2 centuries later is when we see the formation of Islam, and the people that are forming it are saying, what have we become? We used to be people that, were sincere in our practice, sincere in our beliefs. It wasn't about wealth, it wasn't about conquest. And now our leaders are these venial people who are just power brokers. Where's the real Islam? These were the first Sufis. When they looked around for examples of the way they wanted to practice, the best examples they saw were the desert parents of Christianity. And so they began to talk to these desert parents, and they took on a lot of their practices, and they took on the wearing of wool cloaks. And thus there's an interesting kind of esoteric transmission, as I see it, that passes through the Abrahamic traditions. Because you have desert mystics in Judaism. These are the what are called the Essenes. Among themselves, they would have called themselves the Hasidim. But later on, the Aramaic Hasya gets corrupted into the Greek Essene, or Esseni. And that kind of esoteric spirituality of the Essenes that's connected with Jesus makes its way to the desert parents. They become the inheritors of this Jewish esoteric tradition. And then they seem to give a sort of esoteric transmission to the first Muslims. And so I see there's a kind of inheritance here through the Aramaic traditions that is not necessarily about religion, but about a spiritual experience. There's even one wonderful story preserved in the Sufi tradition about one of the earliest Sufi masters, Ibrahim ibn Adam. Ibrahim, or Abraham, the son of Adam. And he's an interesting character because he's very much like the Buddha of Sufism, because he was a king who left his throne to become a mystic. But he was asked, and this is preserved, and it's remarkable that it's preserved, from whom did he get the great spiritual transmission, the awakening experience? And he answers, from Father Simeon, Father Simon, as it were. And he goes on to tell the story of when he was in his wandering, he finds a Christian monastic in a cave, Father Simeon. And he's fascinated by Father Simeon's life. And he says to him, Father, how long have you been here? And he says, I've been here some 70 years. And he says, forgive me, Father, what do you eat? And he says, my son, why do you want to know such a thing? He says, I must know. I don't know why I want to know, but I must know, what it is, that you survive on in this cave. And Father Simeon says, 1 chickpea a day. And finally, Ibrahim ibn Adam says, he gets to what he's really what his heart wants to know. And he says, what makes it worth it? What makes it worth it to live in a cave for 70 years and eat 1 chickpea a day? Why would you do that? And Father Simeon says, well, my son, I'll tell you. Down off the mountain below the cave is a little village. And one day a year, the people of the village make their way up the mountain, and they celebrate my prayers here, and they decorate the outside of my cave, and they bring all kinds of wonderful things to eat, and it's a great party. And when I'm when I'm failing in my enthusiasm for being here, I think of that one day. Now, this is a surprising answer, right? Doesn't sound so spiritual. But then he says to Ibrahim ibn Adam, he says, now, my son, what would you do for one day to experience the whole glory of eternity? 1 hour to experience the whole glory of eternity. So you see, it was a skillful teaching. He made it look as if he does the whole thing to have his ego celebrated for one day. But then he says, what would you do for one day to experience the whole glory of eternity? Jane?
I have a question. I don't know whether the question will be a side trip, but I'm
All I do is side trips.
I'm getting lost in the history that you're presenting. Mm-hmm. And what I'm wanting to know is, it sounds to me like you have been saying that Sufism emphasizes the direct experience rather than the rules, the dogma, all of that. So is that the non-dual? How does the non-dual fit into Sufism? And if I were to, I have trouble asking this, what kind of spiritual experience is the focus of the practice if it's the practice and the experience that is what is central?
Mm-hmm. Well, I don't think you're lost at all.
Okay, that's good.
That sounds just right. So, what I'm trying to emphasize is, yes, it's a tradition of experience, it's a tradition of transmission that is not necessarily exclusively bound to one religion. Nevertheless, it has been primarily associated with Islam through most of its history. And Sufis would vary in their opinions about that. Some would say, no, there's no Sufism without Islam. And some would say, no, there's Sufism everywhere, among all the traditions. Mm-hmm. But I happen to be a Muslim. Mm-hmm. And then at this point, there are Sufis who say, it really doesn't matter. There are Christian Sufis, there are Hindu Sufis, there are Jewish Sufis. And as to what the experience is, there's lots of suggestions that it is the non-dual experience, but they also don't try to privilege that. First of all, just have an experience. Form a relationship to God. Talk to God. Remember God. And that becomes the primary experience, or practice rather, remembrance. Mm-hmm. And so, from these wool wearers who start out as kind of protesters looking for a more authentic experience, spiritual experience, and trying to get back to something they feel Islam is lost, they find something. And they begin as kind of Muslim ascetics, learning a lot from Christian mystic ascetics. But it's not very long before the whole Sufi tradition changes its orientation from one of asceticism to one of divine love. Meaning they'll move away from the asceticism fairly quickly, and the orientation will become all about the experience of orienting to God as the beloved with whom we are in a love relationship, even a romantic love relationship. And this change in orientation happens primarily around one person, a woman who was a former slave in Persia, and her name is Rabia. And Rabia just means fourth. She was the fourth child or the fourth daughter. Very creative parenting there. But she loses her parents very quickly through illness, and then there's famine, and then there's war, and pretty soon she's separated and orphaned, and being a child, she's, taken into slavery. And she seems to have been one of those natural mystics. A child who's talking to God all the time. And a very appealing child, but kind of otherworldly in a way. She would have seemed strange. Because she's a pretty young woman and very appealing, she's made a household servant. She can be, seen, by guests. But she's very annoying to her master because she's always talking to God. Every time he passes a room and she's in there cleaning, she's talking. And it's clear she's talking to God. He finds it very annoying. He punishes her a lot. Until one day he's passing a room and hears her talking to God. And he hears someone talk back. And then he thinks, it may not be such good karma to to keep such a person as a slave. At which point he frees her. And no thank yous, she just walks out the door. And she begins her wanderings and continues her conversation with God. Eventually, she makes her way to Basra, in what is, today Iraq. And that's where she spends the rest of her life, and she's known as Rabia of Basra. And many, many stories told about her. Those said to be a very beautiful woman, so she wouldn't have lacked opportunities. She never married. In a way, she conceived of herself very much as a nun would have in the past, as married to God. And she lived a fairly ascetic existence, just getting by. But it doesn't seem to be for the sake of asceticism. It's just because her life was completely dedicated to God. And she's such a compelling personality that the Sufis of Basra were kind of in awe of her, because her God intoxication was so complete that nobody doubted it. And so she would say things like that. She would go up on her roof at night and she would talk to God, and she would say things like, beloved, look in these windows. In these dark windows, lovers are embracing. And here am I waiting for you. Come, come. When will you come? And she says things like, do I have it written somewhere? Oh, yes. She says to God in one of these prayers, I've loved you with two loves, one that is unworthy of you and one that is lost in you. In the unworthy love, there is still you and I. In the worthy love, there is only you. So that's beyond the duality, right? Elsewhere she says, if I worship you out of fear of hell, then send me there. If I worship you desiring heaven, then bar the gates. But if I worship you for your own sake, then do not deny me the vision of your eternal beauty. So, and the idea that she begins to give these Sufi mystics is that heaven and hell are both unworthy motivators. You're going to worship God for fear? It's unworthy. You're going to worship God because you want a reward? Unworthy. Only love is a worthy motivator. That's what she was saying. Only love is a worthy motivator. And that's for its own sake. And it's around her, though the most famous male Sufi of her period and of Basra is a man named Hassan of Basra. And they're a kind of pair. Is an interesting story, a really fascinating story, actually, of Rabia walking through the streets of Basra naked. You imagine this in Muslim society. But the situation would be something like you might see in India, where you see a sadhu just walking sky-clad, as they say, through the streets. And she's walking naked through the streets one day, and she comes to a corner of the street where there's a young Sufi sitting on a corner, and as she comes up to the corner, she sees a man crossing the street in front of her, and she suddenly covers herself. And the young Sufi was standing next to her, and he says, "Lady Rabia, why now? Why do you cover yourself now?" And she says, "A man." And he says, "What am I?" And she says, "The teachings say I must cover myself before a man. Until this day, I've never seen one." Humbling for the young man next to her, she says, "Who is that?" And he says, "Lady Rabia, that's Hassan of Basra." But then he asks her again. She says, "Why must you cover yourself before him and not me? Why is he a man and why am I not?" And she says, "You don't see me." And I think this is a wonderful teaching. It makes me cry just to say it, because what she's saying is, you see my breasts, you see my hips, you see my face, you don't see me, but he sees me. And I think that's the most amazing teaching. Mm-hmm. And you can see how such a figure could change Sufism. And so the man that she then, becomes her kind of partner in teaching is Hassan of Basra. And he's older than her, but he sees her as his teacher. Mm. And she does teach him. And yet he's also the only person for whom she'll take teaching. And so they have this wonderful balance of masculine and feminine. But it's clear also from what he says that she's the greater teacher, because her experience is deeper and bigger. And from her example on, then Sufism becomes a whole tradition oriented around divine love. The experience of love, trying to harness the power of love to create transformation in consciousness. Witnessing one thing. We don't tend to yield ego space except for love. And there's good reason. We need an ego. It gets things done. It gets one primary thing done. There's enough orientation around ego to make sure that we have food and shelter and warmth. And the ego gets that done. The thing is, it runs amok after that. And we need that. We need it to do those things. But then, when are we willing to give up those things? We do it for our children. We do it for our friends. we do it for the people that we love. And witnessing this, Sufism says, that's a tool of transformation of consciousness. The thing that will help us yield ego is a lever on this very tough stone to move, this very heavy stone, ego. So it's clear a lot of her experience is non-dual, but also dual. And so we don't privilege it really above the dual either, the non-dual, because there's a great argument in Sufism, which is greater, the union with the beloved or the longing for the union? Mm-hmm. And when you're in the union, well, you forget about taking care of all the things that you would do for the beloved. So we're so motivated in getting to the union that actually a lot of the best ego work actually happens there. And then in the mystical union, it is lost, but then you're not necessarily living your life. You're in an ecstatic moment, and you need to carry some of that experience back into the living of life, so that the way you live life is characterized by that love and that intoxication.
Mm. A tunnel?
Yeah.
So you were saying earlier how the Sufi movement started with basically a protest movement in terms of, the established traditional religion becoming less and less alive, right? So to speak.
Mm-hmm.
And just now, as you were saying, how it's not enough to just bask in the, I'm paraphrasing obviously, it's not enough to just bask in the bliss or the ecstasy of divine union, that we have to also live our lives. Is there still an emphasis on action, on service? It seems to me in trying to kind of apply this to today and our lives today, that there's also injustice, that is being protested, that is with a lot of activism, which is not necessarily informed by love. A lot of activists are coming from a place of anger, coming from a place of fear, frustration, whatever. And then there's the mystics, a lot of whom kind of shun the world. They don't want to participate in making the world a better place. They just want to bask in the ecstasy. And it seems like we need a combination where the the spiritual connection informs the activism. Is there anything in Sufism that might correspond to that notion?
Yes. Well, inasmuch as Sufism, is born out of Islam and is very connected to it, Islam is a very service-oriented tradition. And yet, for Sufis, the service orientation comes out of the non-dual experience. So, from Rabia, we get an orientation toward the ecstatic love experience. And from the beginning, Sufism's primary teaching was about remembering God. There's a line in the Quran that says, God loves us and we love God. And remember God who remembers you. Which shows us it's coming from the ground of being. We are loved first by the ground of being, and it's our job to remember that. And so the primary practice of Sufism is called remembrance, dhikr or zikr. It's really zikr, but English speakers can barely say it, so we usually say zikr. Put an extra vowel in there. And the remembrance practice is basically a mantric practice. So here's this is called a tesbih, which would mean like a glorifier. That thing with which I glorify God. And in my lineage, we would do our zikr in a certain way. We would say, La ilaha illa lahu. And doing that hundreds of times, that practice. And the translation of La ilaha illallah or La ilaha illallahu could be translated different ways. In a simple way, it means there is no God but God. And that's the translation that's usually used for Islam. Meaning, Islam was born in a polytheistic society, and it's to say, no, not those other gods. There's just God. But among Sufis, it's often meant there's nothing but divinity. There is only divinity. And to do a mantric practice like that as a kind of spiritual technology is to create a flywheel in consciousness. Like you get it spinning, and at a certain point, after hundreds of repetitions, my mouth may stop moving, I may stop moving and not even know it. But that mantric phrase is still running. In fact, if I've done it well, the purpose would be that when I get up from my meditation, not just during my meditation, but when I get up from my meditation and I go to work, it is still running. And as I look at, Joe Smith, my annoying coworker, I see there is nothing but divinity. There's nothing but God. So that even if God is wearing an annoying face, it's still God. And so that the practice then has implications for behavior. And if it doesn't have implications for behavior, you're not doing it right. So that's to program my consciousness so that I see the world differently.
Yeah.
Even better, if I have an experience through the meditation of our divine connectedness. What in Sufism we call wadat al-wujud, the unity of all being. And out of that experience, having known that, I can try to ignore it, but I can't unknow it, having had the experience. And then it's on me to make it a reality in my behavior. And the teachings of the unity of all being means there's nowhere you're looking where you're not seeing God. And if it's God, your behavior needs to be different. Like, in a tea ceremony, how do they hold the cup? Is it about drinking tea? That's pretty practical. I can do it with any cup, and I can do it like a clod. There's a kind of deep respect that comes from slowing down. If we did anything slower, we're much more aware of how sacred and precious it all is. And when Joe Smith, the annoying co-worker, is God, then I have to say, that's the face God is showing to me. How am I going to deal with God wearing that mask. And I think the real implication around service and love when it comes to wadat al-wujud, the unity of all being, means it implies the necessity to acknowledge the divinity of all things, to love that divinity, and here's where it really applies to Black Lives Matter. You know, people say, well, all lives matter. But in any given moment, the lives that matter most, or the things that matter most, are the parts of divinity that are not acknowledged as such. Where does the attention need to go? It needs to go to all the places, all the rejected elements of ourselves, of our society. That's where all the cleanup needs to happen. Not the parts that we already acknowledge as divine, but the parts that we don't. And that's where the service comes in. That's where the work is that comes out of the experience, the non-dual experience. If that non-dual experience is not implying work, the interpretation is wrong. That's on us. And so that's where I think they're intimately connected. To exist in some sort of infinite bliss, well, you might as well be retired in Florida. I don't. Is that what it's for? What is, be in a cave? There's work to do, and it's about the, to speak in Kabbalistic terms, the raising of the sparks, the releasing of the divine sparks in creation. It all needs to be acknowledged and up-leveled and uplifted. And we need to go precisely to the places that are rejected. It's no different than good psychology. It's our rejected elements that are the danger to our being. All the things that are in the unconscious or rejected, they're all in shadow. And right now we're seeing so much shadow being brought out into the light. So it's a time of great work. But I don't think there's any good way spiritually to opt out of that work. It may not be the same work for all of us. Not all of us need to be at a protest. But the work is there for all of us. Because as Abraham Joshua Heschel, a great Jewish teacher, said, after the Holocaust, he said, some are guilty, all are responsible. And that's kind of how it is now. Mm-hmm. So I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, that was a beautiful answer. Perfect. Because when we are connected, we just naturally feel a need to do something. And whatever we're guided to do is exactly what we need to do, right? If it's guided from that place.
Yeah. Sharon? Not Sharon Zabel.
Yeah, two Sharons. I noticed that. The comment I made earlier, where some early religions, maybe that's not what they would have called themselves. That word probably didn't even exist. Resisting the some wanting to write things down and others saying that's not the path to take. It will diminish everything if you do that. I'm remembering that there was also a strong belief in the performance or the singing, so sort of a vocalization of what they were sharing. And I'm just wondering, does Sufism have any, are there any thoughts on that you want to share? Mm-hmm. Whether it's a collective effort or whether as an individual, whether it's saying a mantra or is audible or vocalization, what are the thoughts on that?
That was the first and most primary practice of Sufism. Sufism really grows up in Central Asia, and that's why the story of tea is so important. Like, it comes from that area, the area of where the Silk Road was.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really not from Arabia. It really starts in what is today Afghanistan, in that area. And that's where the Sufism really starts. And that really was a crossroads. And that meant that there truly were a fusion of different elements there. There was still elements of Buddhism present. There was Christianity present. There was certainly, the new Islam. And there was still elements of shamanism. And a lot of that is the inheritance of Sufism. All of those streams, all these things that were on the margin. And the first major practices of Sufis in group were something that came under the name, it's still called Sema, which is an Arabic word, which you can hear its similarity to the Hebrew Shema, the Shema prayer of Judaism, which means to hear or listen. And it means the same thing in Arabic. And what these were is what they called listening ceremonies. Mm. But the emphasis is on the listening, but what they were doing was singing and chanting. And that is, from a practice standpoint, that's still where the emphasis is. It is not on the chanting, it's on the hearing what you're chanting. And that's something that we often forget in our practice. It is to hear what our voices are saying, to be the receiver at the same time. And in these Sema ceremonies, basically they were jam sessions. They would come together and they would play music, and it's still a practice in Sufism. Listening to music is actually a spiritual practice, especially in a group. And they sometimes call this meshk, sometimes called sema. It's also called kawali. And these are ceremonies of playing music, singing, and getting into an ecstatic state through the chanting and the beats. And frequently the description was of people falling into ecstasies during these sessions. And then the session would stop. And people would turn their backs to give privacy to the person who's not quite in control of themselves, so that they're not shamed. And when they come out of it, then the music starts again. and often the music would follow a kind of a natural pattern where in jam sessions, there are things that kind of go high and then they kind of peter out naturally. You just feel it slowing down. And in those silences that came between the music, they would recite love poetry. These were people that had lots of memorized poetry, and they would just start to call it out into the silence. And then the music would start again, and the chanting. So that's a primary practice of Sufism. The more solitary practice is the zikr by yourself. Mm-hmm. That's the more group practice, to do zikr together, and then sometimes to do chanting together. And it's less common in America, but there's still good examples of it. So that's actually a very strong practice for us.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. And that's right out of any indigenous tradition. You wouldn't see anything.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that's really the indigenous inheritance of Sufism. And where you still see Sufism in Afghanistan, in these very undeveloped areas, it has a very shamanic character. I was reading an interesting description of a place where they'd been doing zikr every Thursday undisturbed for 1,000 years. Never a break. And this man who was visiting and attended this zikr in this little place in Afghanistan says that there was a long recital at the beginning of all these names of people in the lineage. And when a name was announced, there would be a whoosh come through the room as if a window opened in the wall and some wind had come through, and then it would close immediately. And he'd hear it close, open and close with a snap. And there was a feeling of swirling presences in the room. It was a very shamanic experience. So that's the kind of thing that can accrue in over 1,000 years, especially when it's held a certain way. Very interesting. I see we're at 8:25, so if there's a last question, I'll be happy to try to answer it in a succinct way.
Anybody?
Well, I just want to thank you for answering my questions, because I feel like in this last part of the presentation, I've really received something. I've received a sense of Sufism, which I really appreciate. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Netanel?
Yes, hi, Shira.
Sure, yes. Can I be heard? Do you hear me? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm still trying to deal with the rudiments of Zoom. So I'm just kind of awestruck by the knowledge and information and experiential information you've passed on here tonight. Particularly because I'm so sound music oriented myself. Mm-hmm. And I was just sharing a very personal, private experience with a friend of mine yesterday to talk about this experience that I often have where sound go, I'm singing, whatever, the music is there, and it's off, and it continues. I still hear it. It just keeps going. And I said, there must be some explanation to it. You know, I felt the validity of the experience, but not the commonness of it being a common experience. And so here you are. Yeah, and then
it's the Sema.
Pardon?
It's the Sema.
Okay. And then I personally have a devotion to Amachi in the Hindu tradition. And when you started talking, I came in, it was just this parallelism of, what was the term you had for the, when the scenes others would want to seek the enlightened being, the mystical person.
The Kuttab.
Yes, and the signs of that person, you know. So here I've been in, you know, the last 20 years of my life in that kind of experience and relationship with someone to witness it. So everything was so very, very similar. And I'm still just feasting myself on this point in the evolution of Sufism of the divine love. You know, just that.
Thank you, Sharon. I see a hand, a Dorothy hand.
Yeah, Dorothy, keep your screen down so we can see you.
I have probably an easy question. Early on, you mentioned that you just in passing, you mentioned the something about the use of the bell and the Bhajra.
Mm-hmm.
You were saying that people would thought if they bought that somehow it might help them spiritually. My question is, what is the role of bell and Bhajra in Sufism? I'm interested, I know about it in Tibetan Buddhism. That's part of the initiation ceremony. The student holds the bell and the Bhajra. But I had never heard of it in connection with Sufism and wondered if it has a role in Sufism.
No real role, other than the basic symbols, the masculine and feminine symbols there. I mainly used it as an example because I live in Boulder among so many Buddhists, and I teach at a Buddhist university, Buddhist-inspired university. And it, you know, it becomes a symbol, and I'm a comparative religion scholar, so it becomes a symbol of, like, we can buy so many of these, spiritual accoutrements. We can buy, beads, but it's not the reality. It doesn't make us anything, They're tools of practice. I just wanted to allude to that, to something that is, commonly acquired or easily acquired. We can go in, especially in Boulder, pre-COVID, we could go into, half a dozen stores in Boulder and acquire these things that are used, in deep ritual. And yet, we don't want to fool ourselves that we're acquiring the depth of practice and experience.
Well, I understand that.
Yeah.
But I do know that the bell and the Bhajra are very important in initiation ceremonies of Tibetan Buddhism.
Yeah.
But are they used in any particular way in Sufism at all? Or?
Only in that you will have bells, and the common symbol of a kind of bowl shape and a kind of lightning or phallic shape are standard symbols. And but there's no real use of them that I know of, though I wouldn't exclude the possibility of it, because there is Islam in Tibet, in Lhasa, and there are groups of Sufis that were Tibetan Sufis who may have inherited some things. So I wouldn't want to exclude it, but as far as I know, there's no really use of the Bhajra and the Dorje.
Well, can I ask one more question?
If Gloria will allow it.
We're pretty much out of time, but if it's a quick question and a quick answer.
How would you explain the role or the purpose of ecstasy in Sufism? What's the point?
I think it's the point everywhere. Wherever it's experienced, the point is to break through the common, which is a disease, a kind of mask over life. And the ecstasy is a wake-up. Mm-hmm. And it's not for itself, It's not to necessarily want to hang out there all the time. It's to remove the scales from the eyes and to say, no, it's all sacred. It was never not sacred. It's just we didn't know how to look at it. And that's the whole purpose of it, I believe.
Yes.
How was that for a short answer?
That was a good short answer.
Amen.
It should never be the goal.
Right.
Right? It's just kind of a bonus.
It's a bonus, and hopefully it has a purpose. Yeah.
And we shouldn't stop there. Right? If we get distracted by that.
Where do you go after ecstasy?
That's the question. You have to find out.
Yeah. According to Jack Cornfield, the laundry.
It's like
But ecstasy
better than hell, but don't stop there. Okay, well, thank you so much, Natal. This was such a wonderful presentation, and your stories and your explanations, and clearly your experience that informs them, greatly appreciated and greatly enjoyed. Just
thank you.
Wonderful.
Thank you so much.
Yes, amen. Ashe.
Experience of remembrance.
Thank you.
Thank you. And I wanted to just mention to our participants that tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock, we have another special presentation by Carol Bowman, who is a researcher on children's past life memories. And she's going to be talking about that. So it's not too late if you want to register for that. It will be a very interesting, it's a new series that we're doing called Evolutionary, it's conversations with evolutionary thinkers, and she will be our first guest, but it'll be interviews, and hers is our first interview, but it'll be a different person each time, and I'm hoping to do one each month. Okay, and Dorothy will also be having an event on the 22nd of presenting her new book, a virtual book signing. So don't miss that. she will be reading from and talking about her book, which is a narrative prose book, not a poetry book, on Kundalini. I don't have the name at the tip of my tongue. What is the name of the book, Dorothy?
Kundalini Wonder.
Yes, goddess. What a goddess in the body. That's
God, goddess in the body.
yes. So that's on the 22nd.
Nice.
So thank you all for coming to this wonderful presentation this evening, and thank you so much, Netanel, for your presence and your wisdom.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Good
you,
to meet you
Gloria.
all.